The story opens with a hook, meant to pull the viewer in the moment they click. The narration addresses the audience directly, asking where in the world they are watching from, and inviting them to like and subscribe for more HOA and property drama stories. Then the scene shifts to the beginning of everything, before anyone expected trouble, before the farm's return awakened a simmering resentment in the neighborhood around it. The narrator explains how the land had belonged to their family for a century. Generations had worked, harvested, repaired, and rebuilt it through storms, droughts, and time. When the last surviving relative passed years ago, the property was sold off in pieces, swallowed by development until only a single large tract remained open. That land sat untouched, quietly wasting away until the narrator bought it back, determined to reclaim the fields, rebuild the barn, and breathe life into the old home. But while the narrator was overjoyed, the HOA wasn't. The once rural area had morphed into a neatly engineered suburb where the houses all looked identical and the rules were written like scripture. The HOA board didn't like surprises, change, or anything that stood out. And a working farm, even one on legally exempt agricultural land, certainly stood out. The narrator arrived on the property in late spring, guided by fading memories and the scent of overturned earth. The house needed repairs, the barn's roof sagged, fences had collapsed in sections. But for the narrator, none of that mattered. It was a chance to reclaim a place that belonged to the family long before anyone living in the HOA had been born. A sense of purpose settled in. So did a sense of anticipation. The farm had waited for someone to care about it again. The first days were spent clearing the drive, opening old windows, and letting the farmhouse breathe after years of neglect. Every sound echoed. Every breeze carried a memory. The narrator felt grounded and hopeful, unaware that trouble was already taking shape across the hedges and vinyl fences bordering the property. The HOA president, quickly nicknamed Karen by frustrated neighbors, lived in the house closest to the farm's southern fence line. She watched everything. She monitored grass height, trash bin placement, paint colors, and mailboxes with a seriousness usually reserved for national security briefings. So when she saw trucks arriving, tools getting unloaded, and a long-dead farm coming back to life, she reacted the only way she knew, by looking for rules to enforce. The narrator first noticed her from a distance. She stood at the fence holding a clipboard like it was part of her body. She peered between the rails, scribbling notes, shaking her head at things only she understood. The narrator shrugged it off. Farms drew curiosity. That curiosity didn't stay simple. The HOA board sent a letter on day 5, warning that unapproved exterior modifications were being made, followed by a paragraph demanding a project outline, paint colors, and a timeline for completion. The narrator laughed at first. Agricultural land wasn't under their authority. The county itself had confirmed this. But the letter wasn't written as a suggestion. It was written as a threat. And that made the narrator uneasy. Fixing the house and barn continued daily. Contractors came and went, supplies piled up. The farm felt busy and alive. But the HOA watched every move with binoculars and suspicion. Karen patrolled the property line, turning minor details into imagined violations. When she heard the narrator plan to bring in livestock later that summer, she responded by calling a special meeting about the incoming environmental hazards. Still, no one expected the situation to explode. The real trouble started when the narrator dug a trench along the front field to replace a rotten water line. The trench ran parallel to the HOA's private road. The work was entirely legal and on the narrator's land, but Karen appeared within minutes. She stood on the road gesturing wildly, stomping, pointing, and speaking in long, uninterrupted complaints to anyone who walked by. Her performance drew a crowd. Soon 6 HOA members gathered near the fence, whispering and shaking their heads like the trench was a crime scene. A drone appeared overhead the next day. It hovered. It filmed. It buzzed. The narrator stared up at it, annoyed but not surprised. When it flew closer to the farmhouse windows, the narrator waved it off. The drone retreated, but only slightly. The message was clear. They were watching. By the end of the week, the HOA had escalated. They filed complaints with the county claiming the narrator was illegally grading land, operating heavy machinery without permits, and dumping contaminated materials in the soil. None of it was true. The county inspector who arrived apologized before even stepping out of his truck. He had seen exaggerated HOA complaints before, but this one had been written like a manifesto. He closed the file as soon as he checked the property. Everything was legal. Everything was reasonable. He left saying he'd mark the complaint as resolved and likely ignore future ones unless something serious happened. Karen didn't like that answer. She wanted control. She wanted obedience. She wanted the narrator off the land she believed her HOA reigned over. So she raised the stakes. The narrator woke one morning to the sound of police cars crunching over the gravel driveway. Their lights spun, casting colors across the farmhouse walls. The officer stepped out cautiously, unsure what they were responding to. Karen had filed a police report claiming illegal squatting, unregistered construction activity, and possible drug production happening in the barn. The narrator stood in disbelief as they explained why they were there. But the narrator was prepared. Everything had been documented. Ownership records were printed. County permits were neatly organized, and the barn, though cluttered with tools and lumber, was exactly what it appeared to be. The officers quickly realized they'd been dragged into an HOA fantasy. Their posture softened, their tone became friendlier. They apologized, explaining they had to take every call seriously, even ones clearly motivated by personal grudges. As they left, the narrator realized a line had been crossed. Karen hadn't just complained, she had escalated to false reports. She had tried to weaponize the system. The narrator stood in the driveway, watching the police cars disappear down the road. The farm felt different now. The fight had become personal, and while the narrator didn't start the conflict, they weren't going to let anyone push them off their own land. The morning after reclaiming the farm felt calm on the surface. But anyone who has ever dealt with an overzealous HOA knows that peace rarely lasts. The air carried that mix of old soil and early sun, the kind that usually settles a person, yet something about the silence felt staged. It was the kind of quiet a place has before someone tries to claim authority over it. The farm had stood untouched for generations, but my return stirred interest, curiosity, and the sort of suspicion that groups like the HOA never let go of once they think they've found a new project to control. Before moving inside the house, I recorded the start hook for the video, reminding viewers to share where they were watching from. I asked them to like and subscribe for more stories. Then I stepped into the day, ready to continue clearing the land, unaware that the HOA was already shaping their next move. By late morning, a caravan of shiny SUVs crept up the long dirt road like a slow-motion parade no one had invited. The dust trailing behind them didn't match the pristine polish of their vehicles. Their arrival felt out of place, as if someone had dropped a suburban committee into the middle of open farmland. They stopped right outside the fence I had put up the night before, lining themselves in a perfect row. Even without hearing any words, their posture told the entire story. They believed they owned something here. Several people stepped out in coordinating outfits that might have looked friendly in a neighborhood with manicured lawns. Out here, among the 100-year-old barn and fields stretching into the tree line, their presence looked as unnatural as a plastic plant in a vegetable garden. They carried clipboards and cameras, and they surveyed the land as if they were already planning changes. It didn't take long to realize what they were doing. They were documenting, measuring, and preparing ammunition for whatever fight they were gearing up for next. The previous day's warnings from the HOA chair returned to me. The aggressive tone, the confidence, and the way she had insisted that all properties in this newly included district were subject to their rules still pressed against the back of my mind. I had expected they would show up again, But not this quickly, and not with this much force. Usually, HOAs prefer to ease into their control. This group moved like they were trying to win a race no one else was running. While they surveyed, I kept working near the old shed. From that distance, I could see them tracing imaginary boundaries with their hands, pointing toward the barn, the fields, and even the creek that cut behind the property. Their attention wasn't on my presence, it was on the land itself, and that told me everything I needed to know. They weren't trying to enforce rules, they were trying to seize leverage. After a few minutes, 2 HOA members began taking pictures of the fence line. They documented each post, each board, and the height of each section. They even moved along the stretch near the orchard where the fence dipped slightly due to old soil settling over decades. Their inspection didn't come across as curious. It felt predatory. Even without speaking to them, the intent was clear. They were preparing a violation list. They eventually shifted toward the house, circling the perimeter with the same intensity. I watched them walk near the heritage roses my grandmother planted, studying the vines as if they'd somehow broken a rule they had invented an hour earlier. They pointed at the restored porch, then the old hitching rail, and then the weathered water pump near the kitchen window. Every detail became a target. It was as if they believed the entire property was up for debate. Their behavior became more theatrical as time passed. Clipboards snapped open with overly dramatic movements, pens scribbled with exaggerated frustration, and phones captured every angle of the barn like they were building a case file. It was almost cinematic, except it wasn't fiction. It was an HOA stretching its reach as far as it possibly could. That was the moment I noticed a pattern. Every time they surveyed something on the land, they marked it with a colored flag. The red flags lined the fence, the yellow flags appeared near the barn, and the blue flags were scattered across my fields. It didn't feel random. It felt organized and strategic. Later, I would find out that those flags represented categories of so-called infractions they intended to cite. They weren't checking the property. They were mapping their attack. As noon approached, they gathered near their SUVs and compared notes. The way they stood in a tight circle, whispering closely, signaled that they believed they already had me backed into a corner. But what they didn't know was that I'd grown up here. I knew every inch of this farm, every old law tied to it, and every loophole written into the county records long before any HOA ever existed. Their eagerness to claim authority was going to be the flaw that unraveled them. Hours later, once they wrapped up their inspection, they left just as slowly as they arrived, leaving behind a landscape littered with colored markers like someone had tried to plant a rainbow into the soil. The sight of those flags bothered me, not because of what they represented, but because the HOA believed they had the power to place them there in the first place. They had assumed this land fell under their control, but they had no idea what they were walking into. When they disappeared down the road, I walked the property and counted every marker. Dozens of them cluttered the ground. Some were placed in spots so absurd that the meaning was almost comical. A flag sat next to a patch of wildflowers simply because the area wasn't mowed to suburban standards. Another flag marked the old well pump that had been part of the farm since before the HOA members' grandparents even were born. None of their claims made sense because the land didn't belong to their jurisdiction. Their arrogance gave me clarity. I realized they weren't just overstepping, they were expecting a fight, and they thought they had already won. But their mistake was assuming I didn't know the history buried in these acres. This land had been protected by a series of old agricultural exemptions that prevented it from ever being placed under HOA authority, and those exemptions were still fully active. The HOA had walked into a trap without even knowing it existed. They were trying to regulate a property they legally had no right to touch. As the sun dipped behind the trees, I gathered every marker and stacked them neatly near the barn. Tomorrow, I would start taking action. The HOA had made their first move, and now it was my turn. The fight for the farm was only beginning, and their arrogance had already given me the advantage.
The sun rose over the valley with the same slow confidence it always had, casting soft streaks of gold across the fields that had once belonged to generations of your family. Now, after a century of shifting ownership, neglect, and corporate development, the land rested in your hands again. But the tension that had started with the HOA's first visit wasn't fading. If anything, it was tightening around the edges of the property like a rope being pulled from both ends. Before moving forward, you briefly reminded viewers to say which country they were watching from, and to like and subscribe for more stories just like this one. The hook echoed the chaos that was about to unfold on your land. Then the narration deepened and returned to the farm. The second chapter had ended at the moment you noticed the small wooden stakes tucked into the grass behind the barn. Now you crouched over them, brushing away loose hay and dust to study the bright orange flags fluttering at the top. They were marked with the initials of a nearby surveying company. You understood exactly what that meant. Someone had commissioned a private survey of your property without your permission. The only reason an HOA would do this was simple. They intended to push a boundary dispute. You straightened up and scanned the field. Every stake formed a line, and that line was several yards inside what the century-old deed said belonged to you. It wasn't a mistake. It was a move. Someone from the HOA was hoping to shrink your land, redraw history, and hope you folded before fighting back. You didn't move the stakes. You didn't touch a single one. Instead, you walked the entire line, tracking its path until it reached the stream that split the eastern side of the property. The stream was small, but important. Years ago, the original property lines treated it as a natural marker. But the stakes didn't follow the stream. They cut right through the brush and ended behind the neighbor's lot, forming an intentional path for someone to claim a new shared access point. It told you everything you needed to know. This wasn't the HOA acting out of confusion. It was a coordinated land grab. You returned to the farmhouse and pulled out the old deed, spreading it across the kitchen table. The ink had faded with age, but the lines were still clear enough to read. The measurements were handwritten, the kind you needed patience to interpret, but they matched the land exactly as your family had described it over the years. The modern survey flags were off by at least 15 feet in several places. Anyone who had spent time here would have known, but the HOA board wasn't working with memory. They were working with ambition. You took pictures of everything: the flags, the exact GPS coordinates, the distance from old markers. You didn't want assumptions. You wanted evidence. The next day, you quietly hired your own surveyor. Unlike the first crew, this one had your blessing. You met them at dawn and watched them work. They traced the land with laser precision, moving with calm confidence. They compared everything to the original plat map you provided. The longer they worked, the clearer the truth became. The HOA stakes were deliberate, not mistaken. The surveyors shook their head during the final review. They had seen this kind of thing before. HOAs trying to annex land without a fight. Developers trying to push property lines to increase shared access roads, future projects, and potential profits. It happened often enough, but usually the target folded rather than endure a legal battle. Your surveyor filed their report, notarized it on the spot, and left you with a stack of documented proof. The trap you planned wasn't dramatic. It didn't involve conflict, shouting, or confrontation. Your advantage was simple. These people didn't know this land like your family had. They didn't understand that the farm was laid out with intention and that these old boundaries weren't flexible lines to redraw. They were documented history. And you weren't done gathering information. A few days later, you drove into town to visit the county clerk's office. It was exactly the place the HOA expected you not to go. Most people avoided it, thinking it was dull or overwhelming. But to you, it felt like opening an archive that held every move the HOA had made over the past decade. You sifted through public filings, recent permit requests, and every piece of documentation related to boundary adjustments in the area. Then you found it. A request from the HOA board, filed quietly and without community vote, asking for approval to create a new easement for shared community water access. The request mentioned one requirement. They needed a strip of land connecting the end of the neighborhood road to the creek behind your property. It matched the exact line of stakes you had found. They didn't just want access to the water, they wanted control over it. And they wanted to claim historical use so they wouldn't have to compensate you. But the creek had never been part of the community's shared property. It had belonged to your family farm from the beginning. That meant the HOA needed your land before moving forward with their plan. When they realized you weren't going to hand over that land voluntarily, they escalated. The cops they sent in the earlier chapter were Phase 1. The survey stakes were Phase 2. Somewhere in their plans, there was likely a Phase 3. You began preparing for it. You organized your files, printed multiple copies of every document, and placed them in waterproofed sleeves. You installed cameras along the back fields, facing the creek, the barn, and the tree line. You kept your own notes organized, labeling everything. You also spent more time walking the farm's borders, reacquainting yourself with the land the way your grandfather used to, slowly, carefully, taking in every detail. You learned which fence posts leaned, which patches of grass grew thinner, which animal paths cut through the brush. If anyone decided to trespass, you would know. The land itself would show signs long before a person appeared. One evening, while checking the southern corner of the property, you spotted tire tracks near the tree line. They didn't belong to you. The tread pattern didn't match any vehicle you owned. Someone from the HOA or their hired surveying crew had driven onto the land again. You followed the trail until it vanished near the stream. There were footprints too, multiple sets, some deep, some light, some overlapping. They suggested more than one person had been there, likely on different days. You photographed everything. The HOA had crossed into full trespassing, and they were doing it repeatedly. When you finally returned to the farmhouse, the air felt heavy with the weight of what was coming. You had the evidence. You had the history. You had the law on your side. But the HOA didn't know that. They believed they were dealing with someone who had bought the land without understanding its significance. What they didn't know was that you had grown up hearing every story about this ground, every struggle, every victory, every betrayal, too. The land had always required its owners to defend it, and now it was your turn. You closed the door behind you, feeling the pressure shift, as if the house itself understood the fight ahead. This wasn't just a dispute anymore. It was a line being drawn, one that HOA never should have crossed. And they were about to learn that you weren't the type to let anyone rewrite your family's history.
The morning after the chaotic confrontation on the old farm road, the air felt heavier than usual. The sky hung low, as if it understood that the land was bracing for whatever the HOA planned next. Word had already spread through the township that the association had crossed a line by sending police to a private farm without cause. Some neighbors kept their distance, worried the conflict might drag them in. Others watched with quiet curiosity, sensing that the story unfolding on this land was becoming much larger than a dispute over property boundaries. The restored farmhouse was still waking up when a truck rolled in from the north. It was the same route the original family had used for generations to bring in tools, feed, and supplies. The engine noise echoed across the fields, bouncing against the barn walls. The farmer stepped out of the truck with the kind of steady calm that only comes from deep roots and years of hard work. He knew that the next move wasn't about retaliation. It was about securing the farm properly and making sure no one could ever exploit it again. Before anything else, he walked the perimeter. The land felt scarred from years of neglect under the previous owner, someone who had looked the other way when the HOA began asserting influence over the surrounding area.
Rusted fence lines needed tightening, gates needed new latches, and several corners of the property still bore the faint footprints of people who had no business being there. The farmer made notes as he walked. Every detail mattered. The more carefully he documented the state of the land, the stronger his position would be in whatever battle was coming. The largest issue lay in the southeast section, near the tree line. The HOA had taken advantage of the overgrowth and had quietly shifted a boundary marker several yards inward, claiming the land as their community easement. The move wasn't legal, but it was clever, and they assumed no one would ever check. But now the rightful owner had returned, and they were about to learn how costly their assumption would be. By midday, survey flags dotted the farm like bright reminders of the truth. The farmer had hired a licensed surveyor with a long history in the region. The surveyor knew the land better than most and recognized the family name immediately. He remembered the original layout and could confirm that the HOA's easement was nothing but a bold attempt to swallow private land into their control. As the surveyor worked, he shook his head at the audacity of what had been done. No association had the authority to adjust a property line without a formal, recorded agreement. The HOA's map was a fiction. Once the new measurements were recorded, the farmer stored the documents in several safe places. He understood how disputes escalated. Papers conveniently disappeared. Files became misplaced as certain parties claimed ignorance when the truth came out. That wouldn't happen this time. Everything was backed up, photographed, and notarized before sundown. The next step was reinforcing the farm in a way that didn't look confrontational but sent a clear message. Old fence posts were replaced with solid pressure-treated beams. Fresh strands of sturdy wire were pulled tight, straight, and unbreakable across the new boundaries. Gates were upgraded with heavy farm-grade locks. Cameras were installed on the corners of the property, positioned so subtly that no one approaching could claim they didn't know they were being recorded. By evening, the farm looked stronger and more alive than it had in decades. It wasn't just protection, it was restoration, the kind that honored both the past and the future. The HOA wasn't quiet for long. By late afternoon, a group of board members drove slowly past the farm, pretending to check on neighborhood safety. Their cars crawled up the road, stopping long enough for each of them to stare at the new gates and cameras. They whispered amongst themselves through cracked windows, clearly agitated. One of them pointed toward the boundary stakes, another scribbled something into a notebook, and a third snapped photos with a phone. They expected the farmer to come rushing out, ready to argue. Instead, they were ignored. The farmer stayed focused on repairing an irrigation line near the creek. His calm dismissal frustrated them even more. They wanted conflict. They wanted a reaction they could twist into justification for the stunt they had pulled the day before. Without one, all they had was the truth, and the truth wasn't on their side. The next afternoon, an official letter showed up in the farmhouse mailbox. The envelope carried the HOA's emblem printed in oversized gold ink, as if meant to intimidate. Inside was a notice stating that the recent redevelopment on the property violated several of the association's guidelines. According to them, the new fencing was not approved, the cameras were unauthorized monitoring equipment, and the farmer was obstructing the community's shared access path. The letter was written with a confidence that didn't match reality. The farm wasn't part of the HOA. It never had been. The original deeds predated the association by nearly a century, and the land sat fully outside their jurisdiction. But the HOA's strategy was clear. Overwhelm and pressure. Hope the owner didn't know his rights. Hope fear would do the rest. The farmer set the letter on the kitchen table and reviewed it slowly. Every claim, every accusation, every so-called violation. Then he drafted his response. It wasn't emotional or aggressive. It was calm, direct, and supported by the full weight of legal documentation. The HOA's letter was based on false authority, and the reply made that clear. Copies of the updated survey and the original deeds were included with the response. Everything was written in a way that made it impossible to ignore. He delivered it by hand to the HOA office, not because he wanted a confrontation, but because he wanted to see their faces when they read it. The board members flipped through the pages with stiff expressions, realizing quickly that the situation had shifted. They weren't dealing with a confused newcomer.
They were dealing with someone who knew the land better than they did, and who had the law firmly on his side. Still, they tried to maintain the facade of control. They told him they needed time to review the documents. They claimed they would consult legal counsel. But the panic in their eyes gave away the truth. Their attempt to pull the farm into their influence was falling apart. By nightfall, the farmhouse felt quiet again. But the calm wasn't peace. It was the kind of pause that comes when both sides brace for the next move. The HOA wasn't finished. They had too much pride invested to back down now. They would reach deeper, push harder, and try something bolder. And the farmer knew exactly what they would try next. He spent the evening preparing the next phase of his plan, one that would turn the HOA's own stubbornness into a problem they couldn't escape. When morning came, the trap would be ready.
The next morning settled over the valley in a slow, steady rise of gold light, warming the barns, the old trees, and the weathered boards of the farmhouse porch. It should have been a peaceful dawn, quiet with nothing but birds and the hum of the fields. Instead, the land carried a tension that felt heavier than the early fog. Word had already spread through the community. Some neighbors whispered support, others whispered fear, and the HOA board whispered whatever suited them in the moment. The farm sat in the center of those clashing currents, like a rock holding its ground in a fast river. Inside the house, the air still held the faint smell of coffee and last night's dust from where the deputies had stumbled across your trap. You replayed their faces in your mind, not for satisfaction, but to understand the shift. They had come expecting an easy win. They had left knowing the home they tried to intimidate was not as vulnerable as they assumed. You didn't celebrate it. You simply took the truth for what it was. The HOA pushed, and now they knew the push had resistance. You spent the first hours of the morning walking the property to inspect the damage and reset anything disturbed. Most of the traps were not dangerous, only disruptive. Time sinks, visual reminders. Things meant to show intruders they weren't welcome without harming them. The real defenses, the ones built into the land itself long before you returned, needed no adjustment. The ravine, the old logging road, the dense tangle of unkept woods on the north boundary. Those were your real edges, and they were already doing their work. As you crossed the back field, a memory rose of your grandfather walking these same paths. He didn't talk much, but he had a way of teaching through repetition. Fix this. Clear that fence line. Keep an eye on the sky. He would have understood the fight you were in now, even if he wouldn't have liked the politics around it. He believed in handling things quietly, but he also believed in standing your ground. That part had passed into you, and it was showing up now in ways you never expected. By mid-morning, your phone buzzed with messages. Some were neighbors offering cautious support. Others were HOA board members pretending to be calm while hiding their frustration behind stiff language. One message stood out. A local reporter had caught wind of a dispute between a historic property owner and a community association. The HOA must have fed her a version that made them look reasonable. You ignored the message. You weren't giving them free publicity or helping their narrative grow. Instead, you spent the later part of the morning reinforcing the boundaries of the trap system. The land had a natural layout that funneled people, almost as if the hill itself had opinions. You used that to your advantage. You cleared some sections, rerouted others, and placed a few markers that looked simple on the surface, but directed people exactly where you wanted them to go. Everything you did blended with the land. Nothing drew attention. It was all designed to use curiosity against anyone who trespassed again. By early afternoon, you drove into town for supplies. The hardware store owner nodded when you entered, a small gesture that carried more meaning after last night's events. People in small towns have a way of knowing things even before they're spoken out loud. No one mentioned the HOA, no one asked questions. They respected your space the way they had with your grandfather years ago. You picked up what you needed and left quietly. The drive back felt heavier than earlier. The closer you got to the farm, the more the unsettled feeling returned. At the end of the long road, you spotted a small SUV parked near the private gate. Your pulse tightened. For a moment, you wondered if the HOA had already decided to escalate. When you got closer, you saw a woman standing near the fence, taking photos with her phone. Not a deputy, not an HOA board member. Probably the reporter who messaged you. She stepped closer, waving in a way she hoped felt polite. You didn't open the gate. You didn't greet her. She tried to call out, but you pointed to the "no trespassing" sign and waited. She hesitated, then slowly backed away, her expression shifting from hopeful to irritated. She returned to her SUV and drove off. You let her go. You weren't giving the HOA a piece of your voice they could twist. The rest of the afternoon moved quietly until around 4. Clouds rolled in thick from the west, bringing the smell of rain and the taste of something that felt almost like anticipation. You were tightening a loose hinge on the barn when you saw movement near the southern boundary. A group of HOA members gathered at the edge of the private road, 6 of them, all dressed like they wanted to appear official even though none of them had authority to be there. They didn't cross the line at first. They stood in a small cluster, pointing at the house, the barn, the fields. One of them held a folder. Another lifted a phone and started recording the property. They looked like hunters circling, but unsure of what they were walking into. You watched from the barn, hidden in the shadows, not ready to confront them, but not willing to let them wander freely. Eventually, they stepped past the boundary and started up the road. You let them. It wasn't reckless, it was intentional. The road had been reshaped earlier. You knew exactly where they were heading. They followed the path like people who assumed the land belonged to them. They didn't notice how the ground shifted, how the direction nudged them into the old orchard, and how the openings between the trees narrowed in a way that made them commit deeper without realizing it. Within minutes, they reached the mouth of the ravine. They slowed, confused, and then stopped. The ravine wasn't dangerous, but it forced a detour that circled back toward the entrance. They kept trying to find a direct way through, only tiring themselves. The trap wasn't about catching them. It was about showing them the land wasn't their playground. You stepped into view from a distance, not close enough to talk, just close enough for them to see you. They froze. The rain started to fall, soft at first, then heavier. They pushed back through the orchard, soaking and irritated. One of them slipped, another dropped the folder in the mud. By the time they reached the private road again, their confidence had washed off like chalk in a storm. They climbed into their cars without facing you. No one tried to hide the embarrassment. No one tried to save face. They simply left. When they were gone, you walked the boundary again. The rain slowed to a gentle mist. The land felt cleaner, almost brighter. You weren't proud of any of this, but you knew it was necessary. The HOA wanted control. They wanted to treat your family's farm like it existed for their convenience. Today reminded them it didn't. The chapter closed as the storm drifted east and the light dimmed. You stood in the field, listening to the quiet. The land felt steady beneath your feet, prepared for whatever the HOA tried next.
The officers who had walked into the barn trap left the property quietly the next morning. They avoided eye contact, loaded their technical gear into the back of their vehicles, and drove off without a word. The county sheriff arrived soon after and reviewed the footage with a tired expression, almost embarrassed by how easily the HOA's scheme had unraveled. He thanked the narrator for cooperating and promised a formal investigation into the board. It was the first time in weeks that the property felt like it was settling back into its own rhythm. The farm was still in transition, still being repaired and modernized, but the land looked calmer. Morning light drifted over the fields, brushing through the old pecan grove like it remembered something. It was the kind of quiet that carried weight. Even with the mess brewing behind the scenes, the narrator felt the land settle under their feet, as if the farm itself recognized the shift in power. Word spread fast across the valley. Neighbors who had not spoken up earlier began stopping by, each sharing tidbits about HOA board meetings, backroom deals, and sideline votes that had never been documented properly. Most of them admitted they had stayed silent because they assumed the HOA could not be challenged. The footage changed that. The false reports, the misuse of county officers, the attempted trespassing, all of it had shaken the confidence of the community. Some neighbors worried about retaliation. Others were simply tired of the constant pressure the HOA used to control everything from porch colors to mailbox placement. Every story made the narrator realize just how deep the rot ran. The board had been acting with the confidence of people who believed no one would ever question them. The narrator spent the next few days working the fields while trying to decide how to respond. They repaired fences, cleared debris from the north pasture, and added cameras to the last section of the property that still needed coverage. It was a way to stay grounded, to keep their hands moving while they prepared for what was coming. The HOA was never going to let the situation go, not after being exposed on camera. The board members had built their identities around authority, and losing that power would not sit well with them. The narrator could sense the storm forming before any of the officials even reached out. On the fourth morning, an envelope appeared under the front gate. Inside was a notice printed with shaky lines, as if it had been typed in a hurry. It accused the narrator of creating unsafe conditions on the farm, implying that the recorded event had been staged to harm the officers. It claimed the board had the right to request an independent safety inspection and insisted that failure to comply would result in fines. The paper smelled of panic more than confidence. The narrator knew the board was scrambling. They were trying to rewrite the situation, to turn the consequences back onto the person who had caught them. It was predictable, but still exhausting. Instead of responding, the narrator collected every document the family had kept over the years. The original property survey, the decades-old water rights papers, even the handwritten notes from the narrator's grandfather about the boundaries of the farm. Anything that proved the land was independent and never subject to future HOA annexation was pulled out, organized, and sorted in folders. A meeting with the county commissioner followed. The narrator presented everything calmly, explaining the chain of events from the original intrusion, to the false complaints, to the attempted search, to the officers walking directly into the trap set only to document the trespass. The commissioner nodded through the presentation, occasionally pausing to take notes. By the end, he confirmed that the HOA had filed claims outside its authority and that the board had likely violated several state regulations. With the county now aware, the board's shield began to crack. But the HOA was not finished. The director, Karen, had always treated the neighborhood like her personal kingdom. She relied on control, intimidation, and a level of entitlement that could grind down anyone who pushed back. Losing face after the barn incident hit her harder than it hit the others. She needed to reclaim authority, or at least the appearance of it. Late one afternoon, while the narrator was repairing irrigation lines near the creek, several cars pulled up near the gate. More than a dozen HOA club members stepped out, all carrying yard tools, measuring sticks, and piles of paperwork. They clustered together at the fence line, whispering amongst themselves as if preparing to make a grand stand. They unfolded maps and waved papers through the metal bars, motioning for attention. They claimed they had come to perform their community right-of-way inspection, insisting the farm's tree line extended into HOA boundaries. Their voices carried a rehearsed confidence, but their eyes flicked nervously toward the cameras that lined the fence posts. The narrator watched them from a distance, letting them stew in their own uncertainty. It was clear they expected confrontation. What they encountered instead was silence. They continued posturing, waving forms and calling out accusations no one acknowledged. Eventually, they left, frustrated and confused. The display proved something important. They no longer had the power they once believed they owned. The next day, several of those same members sent private messages apologizing for showing up. Many admitted they had been pressured by Karen. Some said they wanted out of the HOA entirely. It became clear that Karen's authority was unraveling faster than she could maintain it. Still, she kept pushing. A week later, she filed a formal petition with the county to force a property review. She framed it as a public safety concern, using exaggerated claims about old structures, potential hazards, and environmental risks. But the county had already seen the footage. They had documentation, timestamps, and evidence of the board's earlier misconduct. The petition was denied almost immediately. Karen's frustration escalated. She sent long, frantic emails to everyone in the association, claiming the farm was becoming a threat to the community. Some neighbors forwarded the messages to the narrator with notes of disbelief. The tone was frantic, almost unraveling. Desperation was replacing her earlier arrogance. Meanwhile, the narrator continued reinforcing the farm. They restored the western shed, repaired the windmill tower, and cleared the overgrown section behind the orchard. Day by day, the land regained strength, and with each improvement, the narrator felt their connection to the farm deepen. The story of the 100-year-old property, once almost lost to time and neglect, was entering a new chapter. But the conflict was far from over. The HOA's grip was weakening, but the board had not accepted defeat. Karen was preparing something new, something larger than the flimsy paperwork and empty threats. The signs were already appearing, and the narrator knew the next move would be the most dramatic one yet. A quiet awareness settled over the farm as the sun dipped behind the tree line and the air cooled. The narrator watched the skies shift, already planning the next steps. The trap had worked, the county was alerted, and the neighbors were waking up to the truth. But the board's pride, especially Karen's, would not allow them to step back.
The days after the confrontation at the old cattle yard moved in a strange rhythm. Tension sat over the farm like a fog, but underneath it, the place had never felt more alive. The crews I hired kept working from sunup to sundown, rebuilding the barn doors, resetting fence lines, and stabilizing the old irrigation channels. Every hammer strike echoed with purpose. The property was transforming back into what it once was, and maybe even something better. The sheriff's department eased back its presence, though the occasional patrol car rolled slowly past the main gate to make sure the HOA's board members weren't trying anything reckless. The officers made it clear they were watching from a distance, and that seemed to be enough to keep the board from escalating. But you could feel the resentment simmering just past the property line. No one from the HOA stepped foot near the farm that week, but I'd see their cars crawl by, slowing just enough to stare without being obvious. Word was spreading through the town about what happened, and people who never paid attention to HOA politics suddenly had opinions. Some thought I went too far. Others thought I didn't go far enough. Most were just waiting to see what the board would try next. That answer arrived early one morning when a courier truck rolled up the drive and handed me a sealed envelope. The moment I saw the HOA's letterhead stamped across the front, I knew the board had found its next move. Inside was a formal notice accusing me of violating a list of imaginary bylaws related to unauthorized livestock shelter repairs, improper perimeter fencing, and unregistered agricultural equipment. None of it made sense. None of it applied to a property the HOA had zero authority over. But that wasn't the point. They weren't trying to win legally. They wanted to wear me down with enough paperwork to make me give up the fight. I set the notice on the kitchen table and took a long breath. This wasn't just about a farm anymore. It was about a group of people who believed they could rewrite history and bulldoze their way through anyone who stood in their path. That evening, I met with my attorney on the back porch. He'd been following the situation closely and came prepared with a stack of documents of his own. He explained that state law protected my land so clearly that the HOA's attempts weren't even in a legal gray area. They were flat out violating statutes that governed property boundaries, land rights, and misuse of police resources. He suggested a counteraction that made more sense than anything I had considered. Instead of reacting to each of their claims, we would build a case that covered everything, every false accusation, every time they sent officers to intimidate me, every instance where they tried to enforce rules on a property they had no jurisdiction over. It was a way to stop their harassment at the root. I agreed, and he started pulling records. The farm continued its steady recovery. The orchard was finally cleared from the debris the HOA shoved onto my property the night they tried to force me out. We managed to stabilize the leaning barn wall and were close to finishing repairs on the farmhouse windows the board members cracked during their first visit. Progress was happening faster than I expected, and it pulled up memories of what the land felt like when my grandparents were alive. But as the farm grew stronger, so did the pushback from the HOA. 2 days after the notice arrived, a group of residents gathered at the end of my drive. They stayed on public land, but their intentions were clear. They held up signs claiming I was endangering the neighborhood and destroying community resources. Most of them were people I'd never seen before,
and it looked like the board dragged them in by playing on fear and misinformation. I didn't engage. I simply continued my work while the sheriff monitored the situation from a distance. By sundown, the group left with nothing to show for it. That night, I reviewed every security camera recording from the past few weeks. I compiled footage into folders, sorted by date and type of incident. Trespassing, property damage, attempts to redirect police, unauthorized entry. It was more evidence than I expected, and all of it would strengthen the case my lawyer was building. Then the moment came when everything shifted. The sheriff called around noon the next day and asked me to meet him at the entrance to the HOS clubhouse. His tone wasn't urgent, but it was firm. When I arrived, there were 2 patrol cars, a county SUV, and a crowd gathering near the sidewalk. Some faces were curious, some frustrated, a few looked nervous. The sheriff explained that his department received multiple complaints from HOA board members, all claiming I had violated noise restrictions, created unsafe conditions, and blocked their easement rights. He made it clear none of these claims held weight, but the volume and frequency of reports forced the department to look into potential abuse of emergency services. He told me the department was conducting interviews with the board, and something in his voice hinted that this investigation might become bigger than anyone expected. He asked if I was willing to provide all the footage and documentation I'd been gathering. I agreed. The sheriff watched me for a moment, then nodded in a way that said he already knew what he would find. As I handed over the files, the HOA's president watched from across the clubhouse lawn, arms crossed, face tight with frustration. She had lost control of the narrative and could feel the shift happening. The crowd around her was no longer supporting her with blind confidence. They were listening, watching, and waiting to see where the truth landed. I walked back to my truck, knowing something important had changed. The next phase wouldn't be a back-and-forth fight. It would be a reckoning. Back at the farm that evening, I stood on the edge of the north field where the soil was newly turned, and the light stretched across the land. The farm felt ready. The legal groundwork was set. The sheriff was involved in ways the HOA could no longer manipulate. It didn't feel like revenge. It felt like restoration.
The sunrise over the old farm came in soft and quiet, almost as if the land itself knew the fight was over. After months of pressure from the HOA board, late-night patrols, surprise inspections, and attempts to weaponize local officers against the property, the final ruling from the county arrived. It sat on the porch table as a thick envelope with an official seal that looked older than the HOA itself. The moment it was opened, everything shifted. The county declared the farm a legally recognized historic homestead. That single designation snapped every HOA claim, demand, and threat out of existence. The board no longer had jurisdiction. They no longer had a foothold. They had lost the war. The news traveled fast. The neighbors learned before the HOA did, carried from porch to porch like a spark jumping from fence to fence. Some were relieved, some were amused. A handful were furious only because they had spent months being dragged into arguments they never cared about. The farm had always been peaceful to them. It was the HOA that stirred the conflict. And now the conflict had finally met its end. But the board wasn't ready to accept defeat. By noon, their president, the same woman who had marched into the sheriff's office, the same one who tried to force inspectors onto the land with manufactured violations, showed up at the farm's gate demanding answers. She wasn't used to losing control. She wasn't used to residents telling her no. She wasn't used to county officials stepping over her and dismissing her as irrelevant. For years, she had run the neighborhood like a private kingdom. Now she faced a property she could not touch. The gate remained closed as she paced in front of it, waving her binder the way someone waves a flag after the battle is already over. She tried to frame it as an injustice. She tried to argue the designation wasn't legitimate. She tried to insist that the farm had an obligation to remain under HOA supervision because it sat near their community. But every attempt fell apart under its own weight. The farm's history reached back a century. The HOA had existed for less than 15 years. The imbalance told the whole story. By evening, the rest of the board arrived behind her. They huddled near the gate, heated and confused, whispering amongst themselves, trying to figure out how they lost authority so quickly.
The sheriff's truck pulled up minutes later. The same sheriff they had used as a tool, the same sheriff who had walked straight into the trap that revealed every overreach. This time, he wasn't here to enforce their demands. He was here to escort them off the property line. The board's expressions hardened as reality sank in. The sheriff's explanation was simple. They could no longer harass, monitor, or even step foot on the homestead without permission. Every action they took from this point forward would be treated as trespassing or targeted harassment. If they pushed again, they would end up facing charges far heavier than fines or warnings. Their power had collapsed. Their influence had dissolved, and the farm stood firm, free of every hand that tried to take a piece of it. When the board finally turned around and walked away, something in the air shifted. The farm felt lighter, the same way a forest feels after a storm breaks. The past months had been filled with noise, accusations, and tension, but now the land returned to its natural state. The field stayed quiet, the trees stood still, the house seemed to breathe again. Every inch of the property reclaimed the calm that had always defined it. That night, the neighbors gathered on their porches to watch the lights return to the farmhouse. A few waved from across the road. Some approached the fence to offer support, apologizing for the chaos the HOA had stirred. Some were expressed hope that the ruling would push for wider changes in the community. The farm had become a symbol of boundary setting, of standing up to overreach, of protecting personal rights against manufactured authority. People appreciated that more than they expected. As the stars settled overhead, the old barn lights flickered on, revealing the equipment that had been stored away through months of uncertainty. The restoration work could finally continue. The land could finally be rebuilt without interference. The fences, the pond, the outer trail, the tree line, they could all be repaired and prepared to last another 100 years. The farm had always been meant to stay in the family, and now it would. By morning, the final evidence of the conflict arrived. A notice from the HOA itself. Instead of another threat or fine, it carried a clipped formal statement. The board acknowledged they no longer held jurisdiction. They wished to maintain a positive relationship with the surrounding properties. They asked that no retaliatory actions be taken, especially after several residents voiced frustration with how the board handled the entire situation. Their tone wasn't friendly. It was fearful. They knew they had gone too far. They knew their actions would stay burned into the memory of the community. But retaliation wasn't necessary. The farm didn't need revenge. The victory had already happened the moment the county recognized its history. The board had walked themselves into their losses. Their final statement only emphasized how far they had fallen from their self-appointed power. Over the next week, the farm returned to its rhythm. Tools clattered during repairs, the wind carried the scent of the pasture, the old tractor roared back to life after sitting longer than it should have. The house regained its warmth. And with each step, the farm shed the last remnants of the HOA's interference. It grew stronger, more grounded, more like itself. Neighbors visited more often, curious about the designation and eager to hear the story firsthand. Each time, the explanation remained simple. The farm had roots deeper than any rule book, and those roots had finally been acknowledged. The HOA slowly faded from the picture. Fewer cars stopped at the street. Fewer notes appeared on doors. Their meetings shrank in size. Their presence shrank with them. The community changed without them realizing it. People had seen what happened when authority stretched too far, and they didn't want to be part of that kind of structure anymore. In the final quiet days of the season, the farm stood fully restored, marked by the county as a piece of history worth preserving. The land felt whole again. The fight was over. The future was wide open, and the place that had carried the family name for a century would continue standing long after the HOA dissolved into the background. This was the moment the story settled. The trap had worked. The land had been defended. The legacy had been reclaimed. And the farm was finally home again.